and welcome to another edition of Australian Lutheran History. I'm your host, Knight Jake. Previously, we've done a brief history of Lutheranism in Queensland and a brief history of Lutheranism in South Australia. The first Lutherans to emerge in Victoria were the Melbourne Lutherans who arrived on February 11th, 1849. Some settled near Melbourne, others near Germantown, now called Geelong, others at Kilbandora, which is now West Garthtown, and others at Wardale, now Doncaster. A second boat of Lutheran immigrants arrived on March 6, 1849, a majority of which were old Lutherans. A third boat arrived on April 22, 1849. This ship carried mostly Moravian Brethren, who were Hussites, a Protestant denomination similar to but distinct from Lutheranism. These Moravians soon assimilated into the Lutheran Church in Victoria. Amongst the early Lutherans was a mixture of Lutherans from the Evangelical State Church of Prussia, commonly called the Union Church, and the Old Lutherans from the Free Lutheran Church of Prussia. At this point in time, the area known as Victoria was still a part of the state of New South Wales. Victoria would not become an independent state until July 1st, 1851. The Melbourne Lutherans had a very close connection with the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Australia, which at that point in time was still known as the Bethany Lobethal Synod, founded by Pastor Gotthard Daniel Fritzer. In the early days, the congregation struggled to find ministers and was served mostly by lay readers. Mr. G. Wank, a lay reader, put himself forward for the office of the ministry. However, Mr. Wank was an old Lutheran, and a dispute arose amongst the old Lutherans of the Free Church and the Lutherans from the Union Church. A consensus could not be reached, and thus Mr. Wank was not called, ordained, or installed. Another chance for a pastor came in 1851, when Johann Wilhelm Jerick, a member of the 1844 Gosner missionaries at Moreton Bay in Queensland, brother-in-law to Pastor Schurmeister, expressed an interest in accepting a call to Melbourne. However, before Jerick could accept a call to Melbourne, a Mr. Rupert, who had gained followers in Hahndorf, came to Melbourne to offer himself as a pastor. Many accepted the decision, but due to resistance from the Lutherans of the Union Church, the call was withdrawn. The members of the Union Church attempted to call a pastor from Germany, but no pastor ever came. The congregation turned their attention back to missionary Jerick. However, as Jerick was not yet ordained as a pastor, the congregation, under the advice of Pastor Fritzer, organised a colloquy with Jerick to determine whether he was truly a Lutheran. However, Jerick did not come to Melbourne due to the conflict over the ordination of Rupert. Jerick thought that since the congregation was divided amongst itself, it was wiser not to become a Lutheran minister in Melbourne. Jerick would later be called to the Bendigo Lutheran Church. For a short period of time, Pastor A. Kapler of Adelaide served the congregation, but due to lack of financial support, Kapler returned to Adelaide. Finally, in late 1852, Pastor Matthias Goeth was called. Pastor Goeth was a Presbyterian who had completed his studies in Sydney, New South Wales, under the Reverend Dr. John Dunmore Lang. While in Sydney, Goeth had preached to a small German evangelical congregation. Pastor Goeth had come to Melbourne and had been serving the members of St. Enoch's United Presbyterian Church. On March 25th, 1853, Pastor Goeth was installed at the Trinity Independent Evangelical Lutheran Church, Melbourne, by a Presbyterian minister, Pastor James Clow. Here, Pastor Goeth swore a subscription to the Book of Concord. However, this calling and installing of non-Lutheran pastors would lead to much division among the Lutherans of Victoria and South Australia. In May of 1853, a second pastor would begin to serve Lutherans in Portland, Victoria, Pastor Claymore Wilhelm Sherman, from the Evangelical Lutheran Mission Society of Dresden, commonly called the Dresden Mission Society. He was one of the first two Lutherans to arrive in South Australia on October 13, 1838. Pastor Sherman had become a member of Pastor Fritz's Bethany Lobethal Synod, later renamed the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of South Australia in 1860, then later renamed the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Australia in 1874, and later renamed the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australia in 1944. Until 1874, Pastor Sherman was the only Elsa pastor in the state of Victoria. In 1855 and 1856, Lutheran pastors would arrive in Victoria, coming from the failed Aboriginal mission at Moreton Bay, Queensland. Pastor Johann Gottfried Hausmann accepted a call to Germantown, now Geelong, in 1855. Pastor Hausmann was one of the missionaries of the Gosner Theological College who had arrived in Moreton Bay on January 23, 1838, being one of the first Lutherans in Australia. And in 1856, Pastor Johann Peter Nepquik, one of the 1838 Gosner missionaries, accepted a call to Ballarat, and Pastor Jerick, one of the 1844 Gosner missionaries, accepted a call to Bendigo. The old Lutheran members of Melbourne were dissatisfied with the fact that Pastor Goethe was a Presbyterian and that he'd been installed by a Presbyterian pastor rather than a Lutheran. Their dissatisfaction grew when on September 27, 1853, the congregation laid the foundation stone of the Melbourne church building. The old Lutherans were furious that Pastor Goethe invited an Anglican pastor to perform the ceremony rather than a Lutheran pastor. In March of 1856, due to prompting from the old Lutherans of Melbourne, Pastor Fritzer reached out to Pastor Goethe and invited him to a convention at Bloomberg, now called Birdwood, South Australia, to discuss a union. Pastor Goethe declined the offer. On May 12, 1856, Pastor Goethe formed the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria, and by 1857, Pastors Hausmann, Nepquik and Garrick had all joined the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria. From the 9th to the 17th of September of 1860, Pastor Fritzer once again invited Pastor Goethe to a convention of the now named Evangelical Lutheran Synod of South Australia, commonly called the South Australian Synod. Pastor Goethe and Hausmann of the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria attended the convention. Here, the South Australian Synod and the Victorian Synod discussed the possibility of a union. An agreement of union was reached, on the condition that Pastors Goethe and Hausmann received consent from their congregations. Consent was not given, and Goethe stated that the Victoria Synod was not yet ripe enough for fellowship. However, many of the members of Trinity Lutheran Church Melbourne sought to abide by the agreement reached at the convention and broke off and formed the St. John's Lutheran Church Melbourne and joined the South Australian Synod. In 1860, in South Australia, a group broke off from Pastor Carville's Light Path Langmale Synod and formed the Tanunda Light Path Synod. And in 1866, the Tanunda Light Path Synod entered into fellowship with the Victorian Synod. In 1864, the Light Path Langmale Synod and the South Australian Synod established the Confessional Union, a fellowship but not a merger. This lasted only 10 years, for in 1874 the Tanunda Light Path Synod and the Light Path Langmale Synod reunited and became the Evangelical Lutheran Emmanuel Synod, commonly called the Emmanuel Synod. Due to the Tanunda Light Path Synod's former fellowship with the Victorian Synod, the Emmanuel Synod opted to retain fellowship with the Victorians. The South Australian Synod, now called the ELSA, disapproved of this fellowship due to the Victorians' practice of calling non-Lutheran pastors, and thus the confessional union was dissolved. In 1876, the Emmanuel Synod and the Victorian Synod formed the Evangelical Lutheran General Synod of Australia, commonly called the General Synod, again a fellowship but not a merger. In 1884, the Emmanuel Synod would leave the General Synod over the same issues as the ELSA, the Victorians' practice of calling non-Lutheran pastors. At this point, a small group who desired to remain in the General Synod would break off from the Emmanuel Synod. This group would call themselves the Emmanuel Synod Old Basis, and in 1889, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland would also join the General Synod. Now, another interesting case of Lutherans in Victoria was the communist community of Crumnow. Crumnow was a layman who had come aboard the ship with Pastor Fritzer. Crumnow was a big believer in communism and had some strange ideas about the Christian faith. Based on the church in Acts 4:32 having everything in common, Crumnow believed in creating a Christian communist society in Australia. He sought to gather a following around himself, Both Pastor Carvel and Pastor Fritzer had attempted to speak with him about his views, but this came to no avail. In 1844, at a synodical convention in Bethany, the pastors brought up the issue of Cromnell with the congregations. Here Cromnell was excommunicated. Seeing that he had failed to put into practice his ideas in South Australia, Cromnell moved to Victoria. He established a communist community in Tabor, Victoria. After about 2 decades, his congregation was doomed to collapse, until Cromnell sought help from a similar community in Benalla. This communist community was being led by a prophetess, Maria Heller, who had immigrated with her congregation from Silesia. Heller and her community moved to Tabor to join Cromnell's settlement. In 1876, Cromnell and Heller split over a disagreement of leadership. Heller and her congregation then approached the Trinity Lutheran Church Tabor, which was a member of the ELSA, for membership, and were soon assimilated into the Lutheran congregation. As for Cromnell, his communist community would collapse with his death in 1880. In 1885, the ELSA Lutherans in Victoria would form a separate district, known as the Victorian branch of the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Australia, including the ELSA congregations of New South Wales. The original name of this group was the Evangelical Lutheran Branch Synod in Victoria. This led to a misunderstanding amongst the ELSA members of South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales, who thought that the Victorian New South Wales group was a separate synod rather than merely a district of the ELSA. Thus, in 1894, the name was changed to the Eastern District of the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Australia. However, when Pastor Wilhelm Peters attempted to register with the Victorian government as a district president, governmental issues arose over the name and its similarity to the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria. Thus, in 1901, the district, for legal purposes only, adopted the name the Evangelical Lutheran Concordia Synod of Australia. Many members of the ELSA were not happy with this, and in 1911 the name reverted back to the ELSA Eastern District. However, by 1911 the Eastern District was irrelevant. In 1908 the New South Wales congregation of the ELSA formed the ELSA New South Wales District. As for Queensland, from 1899 to 1911, the Queensland congregations of the ELSA had been part of this Eastern District Concordia Synod. In 1911, the congregations of Queensland formed the ELSA Queensland District. So by 1911, the ELSA Eastern District was solely in Victoria. However, it wasn't until 1936 that the district officially changed its name to the ELSA Victorian District. As for the Emmanuel Synod, 2 parishes were established in Victoria, one at Natamuck in 1890 and one at Chaparrit in 1907. The Natamuck parish was made up of 3 congregations: St. Paul's Natamuck, St. John's Horsham and St. Mark's Green Lake. St. Paul's Natamuck was founded in 1874 by the ELSA. During the 1880s, a schism occurred in the congregation, with a large portion of the congregation joining the Emmanuel Synod in 1890. Those who remained faithful to the ELSA and their pastor, C. Schonecht, acquired a few allotments at the east end of town and built a new congregation on December 18, 1890. As the dissenting party claimed the manse, Pastor Schonecht, to avoid conflict, vacated the house and built his own residence in the town. St. Mark's Green Lake suffered a similar circumstance. Green Lake was founded by the ELSA prior to 1874 as the first ELSA congregation in the Wimmera region of Victoria. Schism later occurred, with the majority of the congregation joining the Emmanuel Synod. The remaining 20 ELSA families acquired a piece of land close to Green Lake and built the Bethlehem Lutheran Church, Green Lake. As for the Horsham congregation, it was founded by Pastor Hiller of the Victorian Synod in 1889 and later joined the Emmanuel Synod in 1894. The Chaparrit parish was made up of 4 congregations: St. John's Chaparrit, Emmanuel, Arkona, Jubilee, Yellangip and Rainbow Lutheran Church. Yellangip was originally served as a preaching place by pastors Hengelau and Wetzel of the ELSA and pastor lower of the Emmanuel Synod. However, when an official congregation was formed in 1907, it was founded as an Emmanuel Synod congregation and was served by Pastor Fellberg of the Emmanuel Synod. These two parishes did not form a Victorian district of the Emmanuel Synod, but would later become members of the Victorian district of the United Evangelical Lutheran Church in Australia in the 1921 amalgamation of the UELCA. In 1910, the Emmanuel Synod of South Australia and the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland formed the Evangelical Lutheran Church Federation, commonly called the Church Federation. Once again, a fellowship, but not a merger. The Church Federation had a desire for peace, and in 1912, the Church Federation invited the General Synod, made up of the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland, and the Emmanuel Synod Old Basis, to a meeting at St. Stephen's Lutheran Church, Adelaide, South Australia, on the 22nd to the 23rd of February 1912 to discuss fellowship. A further meeting was held at St. John's Lutheran Church, Matoa, Victoria, in May of 1913. World War I hindered the attempts of the General Synod and the Church Federation to form any kind of fellowship. But in June 1920, the Victorian Synod and the Emmanuel Synod Old Basis decided to join the Church Federation. Union was hindered, though, as the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland remained aloof. In March of 1921, the Victorian Synod, the Emmanuel Synod, and the Emmanuel Synod Old Basis voted to merge into the United Evangelical Lutheran Church in Australia. This time, it was a merger, and not merely church fellowship. In May of 1921, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland and the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland voted to merge together with each other and formed the Queensland District of the UELCA. In 1923, Martin Luther Lutheran Church Sydney would split from the UELCA and join the German Evangelical Church Federation, now called the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Germany. On February 20th, 1934, Trinity Lutheran Church Melbourne, the first Lutheran Church of Victoria, would also leave the UELCA and join the German Church, led by their pastor Johannes Friedrich Theodor Frank, a former pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australasia, a small breakaway group in Queensland. The Trinity Lutheran Church would establish a second congregation in 1960, St. John's Lutheran Church, Melbourne. As for other non-English Lutheran groups in Victoria, following the Second World War, Victoria, particularly Melbourne, would receive numerous European immigrants from Estonia, Finland, Germany, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania and Yugoslavia. Amongst these immigrants were many Lutherans. While many of these Lutheran immigrants assimilated into the English-speaking congregations of the UELCA and the ELCA, many others decided to form their own congregations, including the Latvians, the Estonians, the Slovaks and the Hungarians. As of 2018, there are 5 non-English speaking Lutheran groups that are distinct from the LCA in Melbourne. They are the German Lutherans of Trinity and St. John's Melbourne, which are part of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Germany, the Latvian congregations in Melbourne, who are part of the Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Church abroad, the Danish congregation in Melbourne, which is part of the Danish Siemens Church and Church abroad, the Norwegian Church in Melbourne, and the Swedish Lutheran congregation at Turak, Melbourne, which is part of the Church of Sweden. The Swedish, Norwegian and Danish Lutherans all work closely together and all use the Swedish church building at Turak. Here ends part 1 of our brief history of Lutheranism in Victoria. Join us next time for part 2, when we discuss the union of the ELCA and the UELCA and the results thereof. I've been your host, Knight Jake. Goodbye and God bless.